Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the PopSciLens podcast. The podcast that uses media as a vehicle to explore real-world scientific concepts. In the first part of the show, we'll walk through a piece of fiction and take a look at a variety of different production techniques, tropes, and themes. Then, in the second half, we have discussion about the science behind some of the story's core ideas. In this first episode of the show, I thought it would be a cool idea to discuss the science behind something everybody loves, zombies. So, we'll be going through the 2004 romantic comedy with zombies, Shaun of the Dead, starring Simon Pegg, Nick Frost, and Kate Ashby. I'll be recapping the events of the movie and offering a bit of commentary on its themes and ideas, as well as production techniques. And then we'll dive into the various types of zombies throughout the history of the genre, and take a look at some of the biological and physical processes that could potentially produce a zombie. So if that sounds like your thing, please stick around. So, Shaun of the Dead. So, first shot of the movie, and we have a rather strung out looking Shaun, played by Simon Pegg, just kind of staring off into space, smoking a cigarette. And his girlfriend, Liz, is talking to him, and she says that she wants to spend more time with just the two of them, and not with Ed, who is Shaun's best friend and roommate. Shaun and Ed are basically an item by themselves. Shaun and Ed are always together, and Shaun tends to spend more time with Ed than he does with Liz, because that's the sort of normal, completely heterosexual relationship that they have with each other. Liz kind of reassures Ed that, it's not that she doesn't like him, it's just that she wants to spend more time together with Shaun. And then we are introduced to David and Di, who are Liz's flatmates, and there's a lot of, it's not that I don't like you, all the way around the table. And in this opening scene, we're really just getting the sense that Shaun and Liz, even though their relationship has been going on for a while, Shaun is kind of a loser and somewhat of a bad boyfriend. And Shaun can't seem to take Liz's interests to heart, and she hasn't even met his mother. And the rest of the movie will flesh out this idea, exploring connection and interactions between people in various social groups and settings. So Liz starts talking to Shaun again, but he kind of tunes her out and starts staring off into space again in a rather zombie-like fashion, and we get a title sequence that shows many of the zombie-like aspects of regular life in London, such as always waiting for the train, day after day, day in, day out. I kind of feel like any good zombie movie has to have some kind of commentary on society, as that's what the original Night of the Living Dead was. So after the title sequence, we're gonna again cut to Shaun waking up and staggering into his living room, again quite zombie-like. Shaun sits down on his couch with Ed, and he picks up a PS2 controller. And Ed is like, you at work, haven't you? Then there's a series of really quick cuts and pans. These crash zooms are kind of a quintessential Edgar Wright production technique. And as Shaun closes the bathroom mirror, his other roommate, Pete, is revealed in the mirror standing behind him. This is a nice bit of foreshadowing here, as this little visual gag will reoccur later in the movie. Cut to Shaun and Pete in their kitchen discussing Ed. Pete is getting quite sick of him and wants him to move out. Now, the movie goes to great lengths to set up a contrast between Pete's relationship with Shaun and Ed's relationship with Shaun. Pete is constantly complaining to Shaun. Pete is a much more responsible, serious person in general, but as we're gonna see, there's a difference between being a good person, a good member of society, and being a good friend, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Pete is a much more responsible person in general, but he also doesn't particularly care for Shaun's well-being in the same way that Ed does. Anyway, Pete's complaining that Ed has been there for almost 5 years and isn't really bringing any money into the house or helping out with chores and needs to go. So Shaun goes into the kitchen to have a word with Ed, who incidentally is playing Time Splitters 2. Great taste in video games there. Kind of takes me back to the mid-aughts. Not a whole lot of games where you can play as like a bear in a fez, or just a regular guy who thinks he's a robot. So Shaun gets a call from Liz, and it's picked up by an answering machine, and she asks him to make sure to reserve a table at the restaurant they are planning on going to that night. So now we have the scene of Shaun walking down the street to the local convenience store, and I love this because it's all done in one take. It's just all one shot, and it kind of tracks Shaun as he moves through the neighborhood, and it foreshadows a bunch of later encounters. Initially, there's just a number of common events, like a guy jogging down the street, a guy who stops him and asks him for change. But later in the movie, when the scene's recreated, it takes on kind of a more sinister tone. So Shaun gets on the bus and heads to work, and when he's on the bus, we see a guy falling over at the bus stop. So Shaun works in an electronics store, and he's acting as day manager and speaking with his employees, and one of them says, "You got red on you," which, because Shaun's pen is leaking, and this'll come back in a number of different ways. We then see Shaun showing a TV to a couple who are interested in buying it, and as he's flipping through the channels, we get news reports, just flashes of news reports, and hints that things might not be quite right. Shaun is then interrupted by one of his employees, who claims that Shaun has a visitor, his father, and Shaun refuses that. He says, "No, it's my stepdad." And this sets up another reoccurring theme as we meet Philip, with whom Shaun has a rather tense relationship. And because Shaun is in this sort of argument with his stepdad and then with his coworker, he blows off a call from Liz reminding him to make the restaurant reservation. So then Shaun assures his coworker that he's got everything under control and that the situation is nothing to panic about. And we smash cut to a guy running, presumably for his life. Nice transition. Always enjoy a good visual gag. We then also see a guy in a park trying to grab and eat pigeons, which Shaun finds slightly weird, but not extremely so. And I guess I haven't lived in London, so maybe that's somewhat of a common sight over there. I have certainly taken public transportation in Phoenix, and yeah, I can kind of see that might happen. Now Shaun runs into his old friend Yvonne, who is basically just introduced as being a better, more competent version of Shaun. Just a better version of himself. And I think we all know someone like that. Someone who has just a lot of similar interests to you, but just does it all a little bit better. And you kind of like them because you have so much in common, but you're also kind of frustrated by them. No, just me. So back at his flat, Ed tells Shaun that Liz called, and Shaun calls her back and says that he tried to get a table, but that they ended up giving them all away, which is not true. And Shaun suggests that they go to the Winchester, the pub that they were at the beginning of the movie again. And she hangs up on him, being rather understandably quite upset. So Shaun goes over to her apartment to try and smooth things out. And David and Di answer the intercom and are like, "Look, she doesn't want to talk to you right now," to which Shaun responds that if he has to, he'll make the climb up to her window, and then promptly calls back once he can't make the climb up to the window. So Liz does agree to meet with him, but she basically calls him out for making promises that he never keeps, and she dumps him. And we get this very kind of poetic shot of the door literally shutting on him as it starts to rain. So sometime later, Shaun is outside the Winchester bar, where he pitches away some flowers that he had actually bought for his mom earlier in the movie and was intending to take to her, but then takes them to Liz as a very last-minute present. And then Shaun sees a man and a woman kissing outside the bar, allegedly kissing outside the bar. We'll come back to that in just a bit here. He pitches the flowers in the bin out of anger. So in the bar, Ed tries to cheer Shaun up, just as any good friend will do when their buddy's heartbroken. We get a series of flash cuts to the bar being shut down and locked up, and Ed has some dialogue here that basically foreshadows the rest of the film. He says some stuff about getting a bite to eat sometime tomorrow, and then staggering back to the bar, he says some stuff about getting a bite to eat sometime tomorrow, and then they'll stagger back to the bar, and at a certain point, and then they'll be ending the night with a series of shots. And he also says to Shaun that, he's not gonna sit there and bombard him with a bunch of cliches like, if you love her, let her go, but he will say that it's not the end of the world. And right on cue, some groaning thing starts banging on the windows of the bar. So Shaun and Ed come out of the bar singing White Lines. It's a great song. And in the background, we see that the couple that was making out earlier, she's actually eating her boyfriend's neck. Edgar Wright's films are just always filled with great background events, and I always just appreciate some funny background events in movies. So now we jump back to Shaun and Ed's flat, and they're spinning records at 3 in the morning, and Pete comes down and gets pissed off with them and tells them off. Initially, Shaun tries to diffuse the situation by saying, look, I'm sorry, I split up with my girlfriend tonight. But then Ed calls him a prick, and this gets Pete to just unload on the two of them. And he tells Shaun to stop defending Ed because he basically only ever holds him back. And then he tells him to sort his life out. Or in his words, sort your life out, mate. And again, we see here that Pete and Ed are thematic foils. Pete is responsible and hardworking, Ed irresponsible and lazy, but Ed's the one who makes time in his schedule to cheer Shaun up. We also find out that Pete has gotten bit. He has a bite on the back of his hand, which he's bandaged up. So after this confrontation, Shaun is morose again, and he writes down 3 things on his whiteboard, on his to-do list. Go round Mum's, get Liz back, and sort life out. Then he kind of staggers over into a chair and falls asleep, and it just crashes directly in it. And hey, I've been there. But I don't typically get cool transitions, and we do get a cool transition of it just flash-cutting to morning, with Shaun being in the exact same spot, and the camera perfectly positioned the same way. So now we get the zombified version of the walk to the convenience store that we had earlier, and now the guy asking for change who approached him earlier is now staggering towards him. The jogger he passed before is running for his life, and Shaun notices none of this. Shaun just walks through all the zombies everywhere, not a care in the world, like a legend. And he comes back to his flat with a cornetto in hand for Ed. A red strawberry cornetto. So Shaun turns on the TV and is kind of flipping through channels, and all the dialogue on the various channels line up perfectly to tell a story about people who are being attacked and eaten alive on the streets of London. And it's just a masterpiece of comic editing. I can't really do justice to it in this format, so I'm not going to try and recreate the joke, but I'll put a link to a clip in the show notes. Then Ed suddenly interrupts, and he's like, there's a girl in the garden. And they go out into their backyard, and they see this young woman standing there, and they just think she's just drunk out of her gourd. So she kind of lunges at Shaun, who grabs her and pushes her off. And then when she dives for him again, he pushes back even harder, and she falls backwards and impales herself on an umbrella stand. And then she kind of stands back up, and you can see the two of them through the hole in her body. And yet another zombie shows up right at that time. So the two guys head back into their flat, where they try calling the cops, but naturally, it's busy. And because the two of them keep leaving the front door open, a zombie staggers in, and they throw everything in the room at it. So Ed eventually kills him by hitting him in the head with an ashtray. And just as they see a news anchor on the television saying that if contact with the assailants is inevitable, they can be incapacitated by removing the head or destroying the brain. So then they gather up a whole bunch of random objects, just a bunch of random crap from around their house, and they head out into the backyard and chuck all these assortment of objects at the zombies, and it's totally ineffective. They then try throwing vinyl records at them, and there's this bit where they're kind of discussing which ones merit throwing and which ones should be kept. Then Shaun's just like, yeah, screw this, I'm going to the shed, and he dives through the shed, just busts straight through the wooden door of the shed, and they pick up a cricket bat and a shovel and kill the zombies. So Shaun is able to get a hold of his mum, and it's revealed that Philip, his father-in-law, was bitten, which Shaun and Ed are not particularly concerned about. Though they do tell Barbara that they're coming to get her. We're coming to get you, Barbara. Nice little throwback to the original Night of the Living Dead. And then we get 3 kind of high-speed scenes that walk us through the plan in different iterations. So initially, Shaun and Ed figure they'll just go over and kill Philip, and then get Barbara, and go over to Liz's, and have a nice cup of tea, and wait for all of this to blow over. And then they realize they can't do that, because Ed wants to be somewhere where he can smoke, and he can't smoke. He can't smoke at Liz's flat. So instead, Shaun proposes going over and killing Philip and grabbing Barbara, then going to grab Liz, and then heading back to their flat before they realize they can't do that because it's not safe.
This is probably one of my favorite scenes in this movie, and just favorite bits of comedy generally. All the details in the 3 different versions of the plan are really just magical. I like the fact that it gets faster and more frantic and impatient every time. I like the fact that in the first version of the plan, Shaun is holding a mug of tea at the end that says, "I am a genius," on it. It really is quite special.
There's also just something kind of strangely apropos about thinking that you can just ride out a global disaster and wait for everything to blow over. That's that's been my life for the past 2 years. So, yeah, just fantastic. So yeah, they decide that they will eventually end up at the Winchester. And first they're going to kill Philip and collect Barbara and Liz. But the very first thing they have to do is check on Pete, because they forgot about him. They initially call his name from downstairs, and when he doesn't answer, they figure he must not be in. So Shaun goes up to the bathroom and kind of gets freshened up, washes the blood off of him, and then he shuts the bathroom cabinet mirror and sees Pete's silhouette in the shower. And yep, he is now a zombie. So they steal Pete's car and drive off, and they hit someone on the way, and Shaun pulls over and checks on the guy, and Ed's just like, look, they're gonna be dead either way, let's just go. But it's a zombie they hit. And they take off driving again, and we get some nice cinematography of them passing by various zombie incidents as they drive by, like a family running out of their house being chased by zombies, and a body bag in the back of an ambulance just kind of thrashing around. However, they eventually arrive at Barbara's, Shaun's mum, her place. Shaun goes to kill Philip, but he is still alive. He is not zombified yet. So instead, Shaun goes into the kitchen and tries to talk to Barbara and tries to convince them to leave Philip behind. He just asks, how much do you love Philip? And then he says, he's been very unkind to me. And on several occasions, he touched me. That wasn't true, made that up, is what Shaun says. And so that rightfully upsets Barbara, and she says that he has to be more adult about these things. And here's another examination of relationship tensions that demonstrates what can happen when people who don't see eye to eye on a situation can't agree to set aside their differences. Anyway, Philip then appears in the doorway, and he's like, yeah, Shaun, sometimes you just gotta be a man. And then we have this very slow, ominous push-in on the bread knife that Shaun is holding. Then cuts Shaun walking out rather dejected, with Barbara and Philip trailing behind him. Turns out Ed has managed to wreck Pete's car because he wanted to drive Philip's Jaguar. Now at this point, Philip is bitten by zombies again, but they decide to take him with while they go and get Liz. We also find out here that the child locks on the Jaguar's doors are still on, so Shaun has to exit the vehicle through the sunroof. When arriving at Liz's, Shaun initially tries the door, but as the zombies approach him from behind, he needs to go through the window this time, and he does make it up this time. Amazing what the adrenaline brought on by a zombie apocalypse will do for you. Now, Shaun tells Liz and David and Di that they need to come with him. They all need to go somewhere safe, otherwise the zombies will just come up there and tear them to pieces. And so Liz agrees to go with Shaun, and so does David and Di. And from here on out, David is just constantly trying to tear Shaun down. Just a perfect example of an adversarial relationship between two people. But they all get in the car with Ed, Liz's mom, and Phil, and on the way to the Winchester, Philip realizes that he's dying and tries to smooth things over with Shaun. He says he always loved him and just wanted to be someone Shaun could look up to. Shaun and Philip do reach kind of an understanding and reconcile, but unfortunately it's just too late and Phil dies, but then promptly reanimates as a zombie. And the group has to abandon their car and their weapons and run on foot. So now we cut to the group moving through people's backyards, and David and Liz both ask the exact same question of Shaun. Do you have any idea where we're going? But the key difference is that when David does it, he's clearly just doing it to put Shaun down, whereas when Liz does it, it's clear that she's just genuinely kind of concerned for their safety. So David is quickly earning a reputation as a bit of a douchebag, to put things mildly. In the midst of all this, they run into Yvonne and her group again, who still have all their weapons because, again, they're just a more competent version of Shaun's group. And Shaun tells Yvonne that he's going to the Winchester, and she's like, the pub? Because, yeah, it isn't the best idea. In fact, there's a lot of terrible decisions Shaun makes from here on out that gets the group into trouble, and the group will all come to various fates that reflect the nature of their relationship with Shaun. So anyway, so they continue the trek towards the Winchester, and they have to go over a bunch of garden fences to get there. And David says, oh, yeah, it's just over the 20 garden fences. And Shaun replies, what's the matter, David? Never taken a shortcut before? A line that is echoed in another Edgar Wright movie, and it happens immediately before Shaun tries to jump a fence and falls on his face as the bit of the fence comes down.
So, as they move through the gardens, Shaun's mom falls behind a bit. Because she thinks friends of hers live in the area. And Shaun eventually realizes this and goes back for her, which leads to Shaun fighting this zombie. He fights this zombie at first with some chairs and then with a tetherball pole, and he eventually defeats it by impaling it with the pole.
Now, if you watch Barbara in this scene, she's kind of slyly stuffing tissues down her sleeves. It's shot in such a manner that everything else going on deflects from it, but if you're attentive and watch everyone in the scene, yeah, you can definitely pick up on the fact that, bit of a spoiler, she has been bitten by that zombie. So Shaun kind of peeks over the last fence between them and the Winchester, and it turns out there's lots of zombies between them, just like 100 zombies between them and the Winchester. But Shaun comes up with a fairly decent plan to get past them, which is to just act like zombies. So we have a great little kind of comedic moment of Di, the actress, David's girlfriend, teaching everyone to mimic a zombie, and then we cut to the group zombieing their way down the street towards the doors of the Winchester. So the group's cover is eventually blown when they try and open the doors, and when Ed's phone rings and he answers it to talk with a friend of his, and then Shaun just knocks the phone out of Ed's hand and just goes to town on him, telling him, you know, I've spent my entire life sticking my neck out for you, and all you ever do is just screw things up and make me look dumb. And then they realize that their cover is well and truly blown at this point. So David breaks the window as an entrance, while Shaun draws the attention of the zombies away from them, leaving the rest of the group to get inside the Winchester while they're following him. And Barbara finds the flowers that Shaun left behind. They were in the garbage can that David broke the window with. So now that Shaun is gone, David tries to kind of appoint himself the new leader of the group. And when they start questioning his decisions, he starts kind of yelling at everyone. But Shaun does come back and takes charge again, as he explains to David, there was a back entrance, I tried to tell you that. So now they're all just kind of sitting in the dark and eating peanuts. Which, hey, worse ways to ride out a global disaster, for sure. Many worse ways. The power eventually comes back on, and Shaun tries to flip the breakers. The TV comes back on as well. The TV comes back on as well, too, but all the channels are offline. They're all saying, please stand by. Power is also restored to the fruit machine and jukebox in the bar. It turns out that Shaun was followed by some zombies that he thought he lost, and that they are beating up against the back door, even though it's currently locked. So Ed starts playing the fruit machine, and he wins a payout, which attracts the zombies. The Winchester's barkeep now reappears as a zombie, just as Queen's Don't Stop Me Now flares up, and there's a really excellent scene of the group just beating the ever-loving shit out of this guy with pool cues in time with the song. The choreography here is just fantastic. There's also some really nice cuts back and forth to the outside of the bar as David is rapidly trying to flip the switches to turn all the power off, and it's like they're at a rave or a concert. The zombies outside are. Diane throws some darts at the zombie, but hits Shaun in the head on accident. So for the rest of this movie, Shaun will have his tie tied around his head and look a bit like the deer hunter. Ed tosses him the Winchester rifle that was mounted above the bar. And despite the fact that Shaun has repeatedly insisted it's a fake, it is actually a real rifle, and it discharges when Shaun squeezes the trigger. So now the group tries to barricade the doors and windows while Shaun uses the rifle to take out any zombies that make it in. And we've got a callback to the Time Splitters 2 gameplay scene at the beginning of the movie. The dialogue here is exactly the same. Top left, I'm on it, nice shot. So it's here that we find out that Barbara was bitten by the zombie in the garden. So while they managed to kill the couple of zombies that made it in and block up the entrance, Shaun's mom starts to die. And as he's kind of freaking out about it, David points the rifle at her. Obviously, David is right that she needs to be dealt with, but this is being done specifically because it's Shaun's mom that he's going to shoot, and he's repeatedly stated that he's a pacifist in the past to avoid having to shoot the rifle or fight with any of the zombies, but just because it's Shaun's mom, he's suddenly willing to do it. And Shaun yells at David that he's just never liked him, and that's what this is about, but because he's in love with Liz, and he's jealous of him. And they all kind of argue until Liz intercedes and eventually restores order. She then tries to tell Shaun what he doesn't want to hear, but Barbara reanimates, and Shaun has to shoot her.
So David then does the fantastically douchey thing of saying, well, you did the right thing there. And Shaun punches David, who grabs the rifle and tries to shoot him. But fortunately, the last round has been fired at that point, so it just clicks instead. So David unblocks the door and says that he's leaving, but Diane tries to rein him in, telling him that, he chose to come here.
Just like they did. It isn't Shaun's fault. And she tells David to apologize to Shaun, but he can't quite get it out before the zombies burst in, pull him out, and rip him apart. Now, it's worth noting that David, before he dies, is given the chance to apologize and redeem himself. Much like Philip earlier, but whereas Philip is kind of able to set aside his pride to do that, David can't do it, and he sort of pays the ultimate price for it. Whereas Philip still gets to live on in sort of a zombified state. And we'll hit on that a little bit more later. So as he's being ripped out of the window, Diane freaks out and runs out, trying to save David, and all the zombies get into the bar. Ed then tries to make a Molotov, but Pete shows up and bites Ed before he can throw it. Then Shaun shoots the zombified Pete. Liz, Ed, and Shaun then all dive behind the bar, where they light the actual bar itself on fire, and he accidentally leaves the rest of the rounds for the rifle behind on the bar. But they do manage to pry open the cellar door and head down into it. So they close the cellar behind them, but Shaun can't get the barrel latch that leads out to the street open, so they're effectively trapped in there. So Liz and Shaun contemplate killing themselves, and Shaun says he can't shoot his flatmate, his mom, and his girlfriend in the same evening. But just as they're seriously contemplating whether or not to go through with it, they ultimately find the switch that opens the barrel hatch. And Shaun moves to take Ed with them, but Ed says he's going to stay behind, which is a moment of character growth for him.
As, now he doesn't want to hold his friends back, and he kind of apologizes to Shaun for all of his various antics throughout the rest of the film. So they ride the lift up to the street level, and just as they are about to engage in combat with all of the zombies outside of the pub, the military shows up and takes care of business. Now, we see Yvonne again here, who shows up to tell Shaun and Liz that there's a bus taking the survivors someplace safe, and that they should get on the bus. And we sort of fade out on an image of Liz and Shaun holding hands as they walk towards the bus. Then we are presented with another series of TV clips that show how society has kind of rebuilt after the zombie apocalypse. People are now trying to figure out how zombies fit into this new rebuilt world, and they're frequently being used for service roles and on game shows because they maintain motor movement but not higher cognitive functions. We have a callback here to one of the first shots of the film, that of Shaun waking up. But this time he sits down on the couch next to Liz instead of Ed, and they discuss what their plan is for the day, showing that they're back together again. And Shaun says that he might pop into the garden for a little bit. So he heads into the shed in the garden and turns on a PS2 and starts to play it. And it's revealed that Zombie Ed is in the shed as well, and they play video games together. So as a final note here, it's important to note that the zombies in this film sort of retain some aspects of their personality. Shaun's dad, Philip, turns off the loud music in the car after he zombifies, which he previously hated, and Pete maintains his distaste for Ed and attacks him on sight. And like a zombie kid seen earlier in the film is still kicking around his football even in a zombified state. And as seen at the end with Shaun and Ed playing video games together, even the characters who become zombies have another chance to reach out and interact with others. And so you can kind of view the process of becoming a zombie as metaphorical for severing one's relationships and the things that tie you to other people. Through his carelessness, Shaun has essentially led the various members of his group to their deaths, which essentially caused them to turn their back on him and terminate that relationship. With Barbara, who she hesitates to attack Shaun at first, and it's only when David yells out that she kind of fully transforms. At the film's end, there's only two characters still by Shaun's side. Liz, and thanks to the fact that zombies in this movie can still try to connect with others, Ed. And so the two of them keep playing video games together just like they did before. And if you think about it, there's a sense in which not even deaths can prevent Shaun and Ed from hanging out and playing video games together. The film bills itself as a romantic comedy with zombies, but it might be more appropriate to say it's about friendship. And just to kind of drive this point home, the credits theme for the movie is Queen's You're My Best Friend. So I hope you enjoyed this brief look at just a stellar piece of comedy genre writing.
In just a moment, we'll take a look at the science behind zombies. So if that sounds like your thing, keep it rolling. And now we're going to be jumping into the science behind zombies. So as we start to look at the real-world inspirations and concepts behind zombie fiction, I figured it'd be appropriate to just briefly go over the history of the zombie genre and some of the different types of zombies. So nowadays the term zombie has many different meanings and refers to many different types of creatures, undead creatures. And this includes the original voodoo magic zombie, the radiation zombie, and of course the viral zombies. The term itself originates from Haitian folklore, where the word zombie actually refers to the spirit of a dead person. Haitian voodoo priests reportedly use some type of magical powder or substance to remove people's free will and turn them into their slaves to carry out their bidding. One would become a zombie after having been drugged or otherwise force-fed some type of magical concoction against your will. These voodoo zombies were the kind of zombie that showed up in some of the earliest zombie movies produced throughout the 1930s and 40s.
Of course, the classical quintessential zombie film is Night of the Living Dead by George A. Romero. And in this movie, it's actually hypothesized that the event responsible for creating the zombies was a space probe that spreads this strange form of radiation all over the planet. And indeed, this was the era of the radiation zombie. I think it's quite easy to make the case that this evolution in zombie fiction reflected the general worries of the populace during the time. During the 50s and 60s, the fear of impending nuclear holocaust, as the atomic era really got into full swing. The radiation zombie has definitely become less common in fiction in recent years, although it still does show up on occasion, chiefly in works centered around Chernobyl. Of course, the primary effect of being exposed to radiation is not, in fact, zombiehood, it's cell death and cancer. Now, exposure to ionizing radiation, that's radiation strong enough to dislodge electrons from atoms, typically comes with a wide variety of horrific side effects. When acute radiation poisoning or radiation sickness occurs, the symptoms are typically vomiting and nausea within a couple of hours, and then in the coming days or weeks, death. Now, it necessitates a rather high radiation dose to cause acute radiation syndrome. This is a dose of around 0.7 gray or 75 rad over the course of a fairly short time span, which is on the order of minutes to hours. 1 gray is 100th of a rad. This volume of radiation is essentially equivalent to receiving 18,000 chest x-rays over a short time period and distributed across your entire body. Scientists use a unit of measurement called the sievert to quantify the amount of ionizing radiation absorbed by one person. The LD50, lethal dose for half of the population, approximately half of everyone exposed to 5 sieverts will die from it. Pretty much everyone exposed to a dose of 10 sieverts or more will die within weeks. And just as a point of contrast, 1 chest x-ray is equivalent to about 1 millisievert. So, 1,000th of a single sievert. So essentially, you'd have to get 1,000 chest x-rays in a period of hours to have 1 sievert's worth of exposure. And just for some context here, shortly after the criticality event at Chernobyl, the nuclear reactor core was thought to be giving off a radiation equivalent to 300 sieverts per hour. And let me remind you, those who receive a dose of just 10 sieverts will die.
So all of this is to say that being exposed to a large amount of nuclear radiation is unlikely to convert anyone into zombies. It's probably just going to cause a really horrific death. Moving on now to the viral zombie.
So, the symptoms of zombiehood caused by a viral pathogen don't really line up with any disease we currently recognize at the moment. So, it's tough to find an exact parallel between the viruses we see in many pieces of zombie fiction and real life. However, it's possible to model the rate of spread for a zombie pandemic using the exact mathematical models and methods used by real disease experts to assess the spread of a contagion. The spread of any contagion can be modeled in a mathematical way.
And you can alter your model based off of various parameters, such as what the spread of the disease would look like if it was spread through biting or through an airborne infection. We don't typically see airborne zombie viruses in fiction because airborne viruses often have exponential growth patterns, and that would make it really hard to tell the sorts of stories we expect out of zombie fiction, which frequently involve close contact with zombies. That said, the successful replication of an airborne virus is dependent upon a variety of different factors, such as the rate of replication and how long the virus can remain viable outside a host. These are the sorts of variables that impact how efficiently an airborne virus spreads from person to person.
This also involves questions of how we classify the difference between droplet and airborne spread. Recently, we're actually having to rethink this distinction. At one point in time, it was the consensus that nearly all respiratory infections were transmitted via coughs and sneezes, although measles and tuberculosis were known exceptions, and they were described as airborne pathogens. This has relevance in how you prevent the spread of the disease, because, if something is spread primarily by droplets, then you want to focus primarily on surface cleaning and washing your hands. However, if something is spread primarily through airborne methods, then you want to focus on source control and ventilation. For a long time, the standard was to describe only particles smaller than 5 microns across as airborne, and anything beyond that was considered a droplet. It was thought that these droplets dropped to the ground after moving just a few feet through the air. But in practice, airborne particles smaller than 5 microns across can easily move through the air and maintain particles of infectious pathogens within them. So particles much larger than 5 microns float through the air and behave like aerosols depending on a variety of different environmental conditions. This might even prove true for viruses up to 100 microns across, meaning that our old standards were off by a factor of 20. Apparently, we'd been inadvertently applying the 5 micron threshold, which is true of tuberculosis, to other pathogens and taking it as a general definition for airborne spread.
There's a really interesting article that covers how this error was found out and corrected, and I'll link it in the show notes. Now, in zombie fiction, you'll sometimes see the pathogen spread by infectious fluids and bodily material, but of course the single most common form of transmission throughout the genre is bites. And there certainly are a lot of viruses that can be transmitted through bites, such as the rabies virus, but, these don't spread particularly quickly because cases can be recognized and isolated fairly quickly. So really, in order for there to be some form of zombie apocalypse that could sweep across the globe, it would at least have to involve some element of airborne transmission or something that could give it a possible exponential growth pattern. At the very least, it'd probably have to be some type of man-made pathogen optimized for transmission. And for what it's worth, there's been actual studies of the transmission of a zombie virus, including these parameters. One team of scientists used the city of Chicago, which has a population of about 3 million, as the ground zero for the zombie outbreak, and then modeled the spread of the virus throughout the city based off of assumption of airborne transmission. And they found that if it did spread just like a typical airborne virus, that Chicagoans would not have long. It would take over the majority of the city's population in just over 60 days. These calculations were done with agent-based modeling, which is a type of computational model that aims to understand different patterns of behavior by creating a number of different agents or individuals, and then modeling the behavior of these individuals based on different combinations of desires, capabilities, and environmental pressures. So, for example, you'd simulate interactions between agents based off of different friend groups that develop contingent on geographical location. These models are run many times, and then they're randomly sampled to determine the empirical mean of some parameter, such as the number of interactions between people and a group of friends. So there's been several studies that have taken a look at the spread of a zombie virus under airborne conditions, but the news isn't all that much better if it's spread by bite. A team of researchers at Oxford once found that the infection could still spread fairly rapidly, and the best way to escape infection zombies would be to run rather than to fight. And that society's best chance would still be people isolating themselves for long periods of time until the virus kind of burns itself out. And, most models of zombie apocalypses hypothesize, whether they realize it or not, that there exists more than one way of being infected. Assuming biting is the main way the virus spreads, there's still probably some patient zero infected by some other method, or in whom the virus somehow occurred, or if it hasn't occurred naturally. Shaun of the Dead doesn't actually let you see how the outbreak began, so it just sort of sidesteps this whole issue. So, turning now to the type of virus itself. What type of virus could cause people to become aggressive and prone to biting other people? Well, we know that brain injuries can make people aggressive, specifically injuries to regions of the brain like the hypothalamus have been linked with aggressive behavior. And there are several viruses that have been linked to aggression in animals, the most obvious one being the rabies virus, which can indeed be transmitted through scratches or bites. The rabies virus attacks the central nervous system and the brain, and while these symptoms start off as fairly not overly concerning, as the disease progresses, it begins to manifest some of the classic signs of zombie infection, such as agitation, confusion, excessive salivation, and, of course, the aggressiveness. The aggressiveness likely being the result of evolutionary pressures to optimize transmission, as aggressive agents are more likely to attack others and then transmit the virus. There are other diseases that manifest the other symptoms of zombiehood, such as the twitching and kind of shambling and overall loss of cognitive.
One of these is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is colloquially known as mad cow disease. That was, quite popular in the news cycle about a decade ago. Seems to have died off a little bit. There's also a similar disease called Kuru, which presents similar symptoms, although it's really only been observed where it's thought to be the result of cannibalistic funeral practices. Both Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Kuru, I'm pretty sure, have linkages with organisms consuming parts of another organism's brain. In the specific case of Kuru, it was apparently common for part of the brain to be eaten, and in the case of mad cow disease, which is related to CRI, it's believed that cattle were initially infected by consuming meat and bone meal that contained the remains of other cattle. And these two diseases are collectively known as, let's see if I can get this right, transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. They attack the central nervous system and cause the malformation of proteins, which results in brain tissue dying and turning into a sponge-like form.
So now that we've touched on viral pathogens, let's take a look at another type of pathogen, parasitic organisms. One of the most famous parasitic organisms is Cordyceps, which is a species of fungus that is capable of taking control of various types of insects by infecting them via fungal spores. This is most famously depicted in the Last of Us game series. The fungus takes control of the body of the insect and alters its behavior. When ants are infected with this fungus, they become zombie ants, and they're compelled to climb to the top of grass and weeds and different types of vegetation where they are rooted to the spot, and then they die. Afterwards, the fungus erupts out of their husks, and then the heightened elevation enables the spores to spread even easier and go on to infect other organisms. Scientists from Penn State have done some research into cordyceps, and they actually determined that the fungus takes full control of the ants' muscle fibers. And furthermore, that a significant percentage of all the cells in an ant infected with cordyceps are fungal cells, which is kind of crazy to think about. This parasite really does just take over the entire body and all the cells of the host. Shifting from fungus to bacteria now, there's a type of bacteria that turns insects and plants into types of zombies as well. The bacteria phytoplasma is spread through the infection of plants and insects.
The infection makes plants like goldenrod grow these strange protrusions, and instead of the flowers that they typically grow, these protrusions then attract insects to them, and the bacteria use these insects to travel to other plants and continue the process. And while the plants don't die in that instance, the structure becomes permanently altered by the bacteria. There's also a single-celled parasitic organism called Toxoplasma gondii, or gondii, which is responsible for a disease called toxoplasmosis. Now, toxoplasmosis actually infects a lot of people and animals all across the globe. It's thought that approximately 60 million people across the United States might be infected with some form of toxoplasmosis, but they don't realize it. And this is because it's often entirely symptomless, or at the very least, its effects are extremely subtle, at least in humans. Its effects are much more pronounced in rodents. While Toxoplasmosa can use a variety of different organisms as a host, it can only complete its life cycle in rodents and cats. So the question is, if Toxoplasmosa is not in a cat, but in a mouse or rat or some other form of rodent, how does it get to the cat? And it does this by inhibiting the rodent's fear of cats so that they no longer show aversion to cats, and they will even approach them, which of course makes them extremely easy prey. There has been some research that suggests Toxoplasmosa can affect humans in a variety of subtle ways, such as making it so people don't find the odor of cat urine as aversive, or potentially making people more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior. So it makes them more reckless, essentially, by similarly inhibiting fear responses. But, this research is contentious, and it's not entirely clear what effects it can have if Toxoplasmosa can affect the brains of humans. Its effects seem to be fairly subtle, and it would certainly need to evolve quite a bit before it could potentially cause a zombie apocalypse.
There's a type of wasp called the Zatapoda wasp, which is capable of manipulating the bodies of spiders to a really extreme extent. It implants a certain type of spider species with wasp eggs, which then hatch and begin to take control of the body of the spider from the inside. And once it has full control, it will drive the spider away from wherever it's hanging out and create a kind of a cocoon, which allows it to erupt from the body and grow into an adult wasp. So one last thing to talk about here. So now we're going to turn away from parasitic organisms and viruses into something a little bit more theoretical: nanobots and space viruses. So a lot of researchers are working on the creation of nanobots, which have some really great medical potential. Obviously, you can inject these tiny little nanobots into someone's body and use them to deliver targeted therapies instead of using a more shotgun solution with pills or something. They can be used to monitor for the degradation of cells and then to hopefully help repair areas of the body when something goes wrong. But what happens if these nanobots develop some form of malfunction or are hacked, let's say, and then you have some form of nanomachines inside the human body that have their own goal and are using the body to act it out, much like a parasite. So now we've discussed viruses, but how about space virus? Is there a virus that could potentially be so infectious that it could convert an entire species into a zombified form? And if so, could it potentially spread throughout space? A professor at San Francisco State University named Stephen Kane published a paper back in 2014 called A Neurobiological Explanation for the Fermi Paradox. The Fermi Paradox being a paradox, but really more of a question proposed by the physicist Enrico Fermi, essentially asking why, with as large as the universe is and how many potentially habitable planets there are, we haven't found any evidence of extraterrestrial life yet. The paper itself was published as an April Fool's joke, but it does actually have some intriguing ideas behind. So the Fermi Paradox examines the statistical likelihood of alien life somewhere nearby in the universe, and concludes that it's unusual that we haven't made contact with any other alien species. Kane suggests that it could be because some of those planets have been infected with spontaneous necroanimation psychosis, or SNAP. Kane argues that the evolutionary history of Earth has already seen the evolution of many viruses, such as smallpox, influenza, and cholera, and we've also seen massive plagues that run over the human population and kill off many people. Therefore, the chances of other civilizations and other forms of life having similar plagues is also pretty high. Therefore, the chances of other civilizations and species having their own plagues is pretty high, even if you limit the space of possible plagues to the sort that might cause a zombie apocalypse. Kane arrives at this conclusion by playing with the parameters of the Drake equation. And the Drake equation estimates the number of potential nearby civilizations by taking the number of known nearby planets and then using a number of different variables to estimate the chance that these planets could evolve life. Kane goes a step further and determines how long these civilizations might have been around, and then accounts for the possibility of a zombie-like virus evolving on it. Kane suggests that within just 100 parsecs of our planet, there are around 2,500 planets that could have potentially been infected with a zombie virus, based just on the likelihood of intelligent life somewhere in outer space. And of course, based on the likelihood of intelligent life somewhere in space, you might think we would have encountered it or heard from it already, and yet with the possibility of SNAP in the equation, a sufficiently advanced, intelligent species could travel from planet to planet, spreading this virus to other planets and effectively ending their civilizations. So potentially space zombies might be the answer to why we haven't established contact with alien species yet. Alright, well, thank you for joining me for this initial episode of the PopSciLens podcast. If you found the show interesting, please, you know what to do. Please rate it, tell your friends about it. You know the deal. It really does help, and feel free to leave any ideas you have for all the show topics in the comments, and I will see you next time.